So it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening. Tim Jackson is Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey. He's also Director of the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, CUS. Tim is also an alumnus of the University of St Andrews. So it's a great pleasure, Tim, to welcome you back to St Andrews, and thank you for joining us on this occasion.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, St Andrews. Thank you to the inevitable tide of history that brings us back to the places that we should come back to every now and then. And I have to confess that this every now and then is quite a long every now and then. I was here very briefly in St Andrews itself about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, for a talk in the school. But before that, I hadn't been here for over 30 years or so. And that probably to some of you who are in St Andrews for your first time and here for what has seemed like either a very short time or a very long time, depending on how much fun you've had. The idea of coming back after 30 years or so, is probably a kind of complete anathema. But I want to reflect on it a little bit because it does speak a little to the themes of prosperity without growth, and it also speaks to the theme of change and what change can mean. So a little bit of personal history. I was here from 1982-ish to 1985-ish, and that does make it almost 35 years since I arrived here. And I have to say, if there'd been a sustainable development course here, I might have been a better student. I was not a particularly good student. I was in physics department on the North Hall. And I loved physics, I loved what I was doing there, but for whatever reason I spent most of my time here in St Andrews doing drama. And in fact it was what I left St Andrews with, was a kind of love of drama. We had the Crawford Centre just over here, which I think no longer exists as such, but also the Bayer Theatre, where my first professional play was published, in fact. A Rose on the Obverse first performed in the Bayer Theatre just down the road. And when I left St Andrews, not much wanting to do physics anymore and really wanting to write more plays, I'd already sold A Rose on the Obverse to the BBC, who were producing it as a radio play, and I thought my course was set. And until I received the first cheque for a radio play. And it's not quite big enough to get from one end of the week to the other. So I realized that I'd have to do a few other things, and the other things that I did called on all the various skills that I had, like being able to serve at a bar and wait tables and dig roads and that kind of thing, until in April 1986, reactor number 4 in Chernobyl melted down. And it was a kind of a sort of a wake-up call for me. I was sitting there with a physics degree thinking, actually, maybe I have a few skills that I should offer to the world, or the world was asking me to use. And I went first to Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and offered them my services in understanding alternative technologies, particularly renewable technologies. And one of the first projects they set me on was the economics of renewable technologies. And there, suddenly I arrived in the world as a kind of ecological economist. And although I managed to continue playwriting, at least for a great number of those years, the course of my life was somehow set. And I offer that really only in the sense of a kind of reflection of coming back here after all that time and realizing that when I was last here in any meaningful sense of the term, the course had not been set, much as it hasn't been set for you guys, much as you don't know where you're going out of this. And of course that's often true, that we walk backwards into the world expecting the opposite of what actually receives us in some sense, and life is what happens while we're busy making plans. But there is, I think, a kind of an importance in that sense of reflection, and it's one of the reasons why when Bill asked me, I was really happy to come back here. Shortly after, of course, 1986 was 1987, which set a lot of what we're doing in here in motion. Our Common Future, the Brundtland Commission report in 1987, established the language of sustainability and sustainable development in a way that had not been established before. It gave us a sense of looking for a different model of development, looking for a different model of prosperity, looking for a different model of progress. And your own part in that path, the arrival of the honours degree, I think this is the first, Jan will remember what this picture is, because he's there in it somewhere, I think. It's the first cohort, was it? The first honours, the first undergraduate, okay, which is about 9-ish years ago, but is part of your sustainability celebration today. And then roughly about the same time, actually, Jan and I were working in the Sustainable Development Commission in London, which was the foundations for a report called Prosperity Without Growth, which was delivered to the UK government in 2009. I have to say the government wasn't terribly welcoming of the report at the time. There was a lot of raised eyebrows about even questioning growth. And those of you with sharp eyesight will see that we did kind of put a question mark in the title, Prosperity Without Growth question mark, which was an important concession to the political ambivalence, let's say, about questioning growth. And when Anya was introducing me earlier, she very kindly said that this is one of the places where the more controversial aspects of sustainable development, like questioning growth, can be carried out. And I'm very grateful that there are such places, because one of the immediate lessons of launching Prosperity Without Growth was just how hard it is to have that conversation about growth itself. And then the second lesson, which came very quickly off the back of that, was just how rewarding it is, because it turns out there's lots of people who are prepared to ask the most obvious question of all: how can we continue to expand our economies exponentially when the planet itself is finite? And surely there is a kind of challenge where we need a little bit of political space to ask those difficult questions, and where we need courses that will ask those difficult questions, and where students will be encouraged actually to follow through the implications, the tougher implications of thinking about sustainability, and possibly thinking about a different kind of economics. That's period, that history, if you like, of sustainability. Last year, in particular, actually it was the year before now, so late in 2015, gave rise to the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of you will know. And I want to touch in particular on one of those goals, SDG 8, which I'm sure you all know what it is. It's the goal that talks about economic growth, and I want to raise a very particular point about that goal a little bit later on. But the history of prosperity without growth went on and on. The sort of the sense of actually speaking into a conversation that people wanted to have has been one that's accompanied me over the last 7 or 8 years. An extraordinary and very humbling sense, actually, of going into literary societies and faith organizations and asset management companies and big multinationals and political agendas, and actually finding people who were desperate, in a sense, to engage in a conversation which otherwise had been shut down to some extent, had become a kind of taboo in our society. And it's that that's led to actually the revised edition of Prosperity Without Growth, where one of the things that I do in the book, in the second edition, is to reflect really on that process and reflect on how difficult it is for politics, and indeed for economics, and indeed for investors to think about a different kind of economy. And nonetheless to argue that the challenge is just as profound as it always was. That challenge of finding a pathway to prosperity, which doesn't trash the planet in the process, is as relevant today as it was before, perhaps in some ways even more relevant. And that actually a lot of our understanding of that dilemma has been sharpened, of course, by the financial crisis and by everything that came out of it. But it is today more of a place to start thinking about things, more of an open space to start thinking about things than it has been before, whilst at the same time remaining sometimes exactly the same kind of challenge that it's always been. Here's a very useful starting point for that challenge. And it's about thinking what growth delivers to us, what economic growth delivers to us in terms of prosperity, in terms of well-being, in terms of quality of life. And this is a graph of life expectancy in years, life expectancy at birth in years against income per capita. And what it shows, of course, well, at the first sight, it shows, yes, that income kind of matters, that getting richer does seem to give us a better quality of life. It improves life expectancy from around about 45 years to over 80 years as you move from incomes of less than £10,000 and up to about incomes of £25,000. There's a very sharp increase in real life expectancy in terms of real prosperity in the world. And this is a good starting point for a lecture which questions growth, because what it makes absolutely clear is that there is a role for income growth in terms of improving people's lives, and that is in the poorest countries in the world. And it has been, I think, for me, emphasized more and more that you can't escape from the idea of development into some sort of wishy-washy place where material concerns no longer matter. And it doesn't matter that 2 billion people are living without proper electricity or sanitation or decent housing or good nutrition, while the richer economies worry about whether they should be growing more or not. It's absolutely clear to me that in a finite world, you should focus on an idea of development in which the poorest can achieve a decent quality of life at least, and possibly even catch up with those who are living much different lives, much richer lives. There is a sense, though, of diminishing returns. There is a sense in this data that actually as you get richer, the gains don't look so obvious. Life expectancy doesn't increase at the same rate. And you can do the same exercise with infant mortality. A very, very sharp decline in infant mortality as you go from 0,000 per capita to around about 10,000 per capita, and then more or less flat, more or less no returns at all to your income growth beyond that point. Or you can do the same graph with participation in education, and you find that the same thing happens. Or you can do it with happiness. And so there's a sense in all of these graphs that there's a place where development of this kind matters, of income growth matters, and then there's a place where it becomes less clear what the advantages are. And given that what's happening to us in the process is that we're kind of running out of planet, as Bill McGibbon talks about it. Before we run out of resources, we're running out of planet. The question that previous graph poses to us is, where should development happen? What sort of development should be happening in those different places? Where do incomes need to grow? And where actually should we perhaps be thinking about a different kind of model that continues to deliver prosperity but doesn't necessarily depend on growth to do it? Because as the economies grow, the material impact of those economies tends to grow, the impact on the planet tends to grow, and that's the one clear, scarce commodity that we're faced with at the moment. Now, the brightest of you will certainly point a critical question at that point and say, well, what about technology? Can't technology separate out? Can't technology decouple the growth in the economy for us so we can still have the continuing income growth, but we don't have the material impacts associated with that? We don't have the carbon associated with that, for example. And the answer is yes, of course we can. In fact, one of my first lessons when I went to Greenpeace back in 1985-86 was just how much technological possibility existed out there, just how many technologies there were, how ready they were actually to be employed, how they could reduce our carbon footprint, how they could reduce our impacts on the resource base of the planet. And a lot of my own personal journey over that time was trying to figure out, well, if that was the case, if all these technologies were there, the development was, you know, in the UK in particular, we were at the forefront of that development in the mid-1980s, or the early 1980s at least. Why was it not being implemented? And then you have to ask the deeper questions about economics. You have to ask how fast you'd have to implement it. And here's one of the answers to how fast you have to implement it. In Paris in December 2015, an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average was agreed to at the IPCC meeting there. And that's equivalent to saying we basically have to phase out all of our fossil architecture in the space of less than a decade. It's an extraordinary challenge in technological terms. And even if we agree, and many of my students really, when they see that challenge, they say, well, let's just do it. We know we have those technologies. Isn't this a technological challenge? And even if you agree that the technologies exist, there are still questions around whether it's possible to implement those challenges in our kind of society. And that's a lot of what I attempted to establish in the first edition of Prosperity Without Growth, was asking that deeper question about the kind of society we were, and very quickly, of course, stumbling across the fact that we are a broadly materialistic, very consumerist society, and lots of our institutions are currently pointing in exactly the wrong direction. And when you come to that conclusion, then it becomes important to say, what would it take to shift them so that they're pointing in a different direction, in a better direction? What would that direction look like? And in the first edition of Prosperity Without Growth, I laid a little bit of that down as an argument. But what I felt when I came to do the revision was actually that there was a case to go further than that, to say what are the foundations for a different kind of economy. And a lot of what I've tried to do in the second edition is to expand that idea of what those foundations are, what that economy looks like, and to ask critical questions about what we need to know next if we want to implement that kind of change. Where does our research agenda have to go if we want to implement that kind of change? What does our economics look like if we want to implement that kind of change? And where is the political space to create that change in the world? And that was all a very timely thing to do. But in the process, I also encountered the fact that we were 6 or 7 years after the financial crisis itself. And a lot of what was coming out of the understanding of the crisis is that even in its own terms, the economy that we had was not really fit for purpose. It had created huge inequality, it had created financial instability. Many of the institutions that had been put in place to protect prosperity were actually undermining it through the creation of that financial instability. And all of the policy options that governments had at that time, or seemed to have, were in fact making the conditions worse. Because, for example, austerity was a process of withdrawing government spending largely from places where it was supporting social investment, and using that withdrawal of spending to bail out the financial sector, which was trillions of dollars underwater across the globe, and to try and stabilize the economy long enough to begin thinking about sensible solutions in the future. In other words, austerity in those years had made the problem worse, and our understanding of how to fix that had become more and more difficult to see. In around about 2015, 2016, a couple of economists started talking about the idea of secular stagnation, that actually what we were looking at in the wake of the financial crisis was not just the fallout from a kind of cyclical liquidity crisis. It was actually the new normal, that our economies were already moving to a place, particularly the advanced economies, moving to a place where growth, as we had thought of it, was just not available anymore. Now that, from the perspective of the work that I was doing, of course, was absolutely fascinating. This was no longer a question that was just about the usual suspects, the Green Lobby, for example, saying, hang on a minute, you've got to stop growth because you're trashing the planet. It was no longer a question of people chanting about social justice because it's a horribly unequal world. Both of those things, and we can all in this room agree, both of those things are absolutely fundamental. But here suddenly was a different kind of conversation coming out of economics itself, suggesting that maybe the future for advanced economies wasn't a growth-based future at all. And all of a sudden there's a place where it becomes easier, in fact, to sit down in the room with conventional economists and agree that there is a need to understand a different basis for this new normal. Here was a little bit of the work that led me towards that, that understanding, which is a graph of labour productivity growth in the UK over a century, more than a century. And what you can see in this graph is that labour productivity growth, which is really the foundation for economic growth, grew consistently, more or less consistently, give or take the world wars, until about the mid-1960s. And then it declined from that point more or less consistently and faster than it had been growing in the first place. And that's in spite of all the technology that came along on the way, like the digital technologies in particular. Amstrad founded in the late 1960s, Apple founded in the early 1980s, Google founded in the early 2000s. All of that technology, which seemed to be offering these huge dividends in terms of productivity, failed to slow down the decline in labour productivity growth, failed to stop that descent of labour productivity growth. And by the time we got to the financial crisis, actually, there was already a trend in the economy that was leading to a future for the developed economies in particular, which would not have so much growth in it. In other words, here is a really fertile place to have a conversation about the kind of economy that we want in the conditions of the future. And those conditions are a limited planet, hugely divided population, and an economy that in any case, in its own terms, is potentially slowing down. The new normal is not like the old normal. And that's a place where you can begin to be a little bit creative, where you can begin to ask difficult questions. You can easily identify, of course, the places where the economy of the past doesn't work at all, where work is formed. Work itself is a form of servitude. Enterprise is about accumulation. Investment is a form of speculation, literally, almost in the run-up to the financial crisis, a kind of casino economy. And money is a form, a manifestation of power and the accumulation of power. It's an economy in which has been characterized, really, by the privatization of gains and the socialization of losses, something pointed out by economists way back in the 1920s and 30s as being the foundations for the capitalist economy, underlined through the financial crisis, where actually it was those who had been the architects of chaos who benefited from all the government intervention that bailed them out. And the people who paid the costs were society at large, generations to come, the poorest, the places where social investment is desperately needed. And so it's clear, it's the case that this is an economy that doesn't work, an economic model that doesn't work, is very, very clear. And so it's not surprising then that when, for example, Theresa May stood up in July last year on the steps of Downing Street, having just accepted to be Prime Minister, that some of the language that she uses is language around making the economy work again. In fact, it's a very interesting piece of language because she borrowed it directly from Jeremy Corbyn before that. And before Jeremy Corbyn had picked up the idea of an economy that works, it had been on the Green Party's homepage for at least 3 months. The Green Party themselves picked it up from a group called the Aldersgate Group, which was amongst our partners in CUSP. And so we have in CUSP, in fact, a program on an economy that works. And today, in the events of today, in case anyone missed it, there's going to be a general election in about 6 weeks' time. The language was out on the table again. Can we please have an economy that works, an economy that works for everyone, an economy that works for all? And it is a very, very natural call in this time, in this sense of this accumulation of challenges, of ecological challenges, of challenges around inequality, of challenges around the nature of the economy, that we need an economy that works. And to me, that is the basis, the foundation for a fundamental call to economists, yes, but also to sociologists, to political scientists, to anthropologists, to technologists, to environmental scientists, to those who understand the way that society works and those who understand the way that we work as human beings. Because the foundations for an economy that work have somehow they've got to come out of who we are as people. They've got to come out of understandings of who we are as people and what society is trying to do in the 21st century. But the principal challenge, it does seem to me, is very much an economic one. It is about asking, if we were to take this picture of dysfunctionality and transform it, what would it begin to look like? And a lot of what I tried to do in the second edition of Prosperity Without Growth was to be more specific about that, to say, actually, we can take these individual elements, we can look at work itself, the nature of work, we can look at the money system, we can talk about investment and what investment means, and we can think about enterprise in very pragmatic, definable, meaningful ways, and we can begin to formulate on that basis a sort of program, a programmatic sense of action about how to change each of these things. I very briefly want to lead you through some of what those things are. There's a lot more detail in the writing, and there's a lot to be discussed. What's most exciting about this, it seems to me, is that it begins also to answer the question of what is the agenda for sustainability over the next 10 years. It must, in part, I would argue, be about these transformations, the transformative models of enterprise and investment and the basic aspects of how an economy works. And so this is a very legitimate, it's a very timely, it's a very tractable set of questions, because when you begin to ask them in depth, you begin to find that there are answers. A lot of the way that work has been conceived, for example, an economy that works, work has to be fundamental to it. A lot of the way that work's been conceived in the capitalist economics is as a sort of a drain on the resources of producers and a punishment for those of us who are in the workplace, for which we have to be recompensed, we hope, with a decent salary. But actually, as E.F. Schumacher pointed out, there's a kind of contradiction there. The ultimate goal in that kind of vision of the economy is actually producers would like to have output with no employees, and employees would like to have income without any form of employment. And it's the way in which capitalism actually has internalized the concept of work is as though we were trying to chase work continually out of the economy, because it's costly to producers and it's dirty to us as employees. But there is another strand of thinking which suggests that actually work is fundamental to prosperity, not just as a form of income, not just as the means of production, but actually as a participation in the life of society, a way of us as human beings contributing to the society that we live in. And of course, that is an ideal. It's not the experience of many people who are in work, living on zero-hour contracts, insecure employment, and low wages that are below the living wage level. And it's not the context, it's not the experience of those who are unemployed. In South Europe, in the southern states of Europe, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was 50% youth unemployment. 50% of young people coming out of college, going into the workplace, knowing they were not going to find anything at all, any way of participating in the workforce in a meaningful way. So this idea of work as a meaningful participation is a very profound one, but it's the one that we have to accept is a huge challenge in a world which has changed through the financial crisis and is changing again, and in which labour productivity growth, that dream of capital economists, is trying to tell us actually that we'll need less and less of you guys in the future than we did in the past. And a lot of the talk at the moment around work is exactly that. The advance of artificial intelligence, the advance of the robots, the world in which even my job here talking to you now will be one day taken over, one day quite soon in some people's eyes, taken over by the internet, by forms of virtual learning, by massive online learning platforms and all of the other acronyms that go with technological change and try to convince us that we're moving in a productive direction, we're moving in the way of progress. And to me that is a really important moment of choice, societal choice, to say, is that, I mean, there are lots of questions around whether that transition itself is feasible, whether that progress of technology is going to take us in the direction that the technological optimists say it is. But there's also a question of choice there. And there's a question of us looking as a society at what we see as the demand for work in society and saying, can that all actually be satisfied by AI and by robots? And even at the height of the crisis, I went to, for example, Portugal, to Lisbon, to launch a Portuguese version of Prosperity Without Growth. And I looked around me in this society in which there was 50% youth unemployment and asked myself a very simple question, is there no work in this society? Were there no sick people who needed curing? Were there no people with mental health problems who needed support? Was there no social care that was needed for the elderly or for the very young? Were there no buildings that needed renovating? Was there nowhere where you could think of putting a bit more community back into society by building some community centres or a quiet centre or a museum or a cinema or a theatre? Was there nothing in terms of creativity in that community where you could have invested a bit of money and employed and improved the quality of people's lives and employed people to do it? And wherever you ask that question, you're confronted with the paradox of work in this existing vision of the economy, because the answer is always yes, yes. There are always places where you need doctors and teachers and social carers and refurbishers and people maintaining buildings and people setting up community centres and artists and craftsmen building products that are durable and beautiful and that last, and a set of people also who are contributing to the long-term understanding of our society by being creative in it, by creating artistic endeavour. And here, through these kinds of questions, you arrive at both the difficulty of thinking about work in the modern economy, but also the potential rewards for doing so. Because this idea of a set of activities that allows us to create the goods and services that improve the quality of our lives and at the same time asks us as individuals to participate in that process generates prosperity all the way down the line. And it is a place where you begin to have to think creatively about those other institutions. What is the form of enterprise that builds this different sense of work? And here again, we have a form of enterprise that's very much about the model of enterprises as a kind of profit-maximizing division of labor that takes stuff out of the ground, creates products out of it, markets those products, and sells as many of them as possible to its consumers. And you'll find that model in a lot of early business texts that you'll be exposed to if you go to a management school or a business school. And in particular, that last end of it, where essentially it's about finding product niche, where it's about novelty, where it's about expanding consumer markets and finding a place in that market, that idea of enterprise is a part of the dynamic that's making things so difficult. But one of the very interesting ideas that came out of critiquing the existing model and understanding that a product throughput system is never going to be sustainable was the idea that enterprise actually at the end of the day is a form of service. Even in something as basic as energy, it's not the coal, the oil and the gas that you eat and put on the table. It is, in fact, the services, the energy services that they provide, the cooking, the heating, the mobility, the light. And by dividing those things, material throughput from service, you can immediately find ways of lowering the material impact and improving the service. And beyond those material services, you can do the same thing with food, you can do the same thing with housing, you can go through that exercise of separating out the service from that activity, from the material throughput of products. Beyond those material services of food and clothing and shelter, what is it that improves our prosperity? Actually, it's as much about social and psychological things as it is about material things themselves. Even the idea of novelty that we're sold as consumers is, to some extent, a social conversation. It's about telling ourselves how important we are because we have the latest gadget. It's about affiliating ourselves with a group that we feel close to by saying we wear the same uniforms as you or we have the same devices as you. It's about understanding that the world can progress. Even technological novelty is, in some sense, a kind of shiny promise about how wonderful the world is going to be tomorrow for our children and for their children. And these are very legitimate promises. They're very legitimate demands that we have as people about the world that we're living in. But that demand is not the same as the technology itself. That social and psychological advantage is not the same as the material stuff. In fact, there's a very good body of psychology which suggests that the more you try to satisfy these social and psychological things through material stuff, the less happy you become for it. And that's because actually it was never the materials you wanted in the first place. It was the social and psychological goals. It was about your own sense of self-esteem and worth. It was about your sense of belonging to other people. It was about your solidarity with other people. It was about how secure you felt in your community. And these goods, these service-based goods, are actually the things that ultimately contribute to our prosperity. So what if we split those ideas apart, the material side of things, from the delivering of prosperity? And what if our enterprises become, in fact, service organizations? They deliver the services that make the quality of our lives better. And this is a very, very simple example of that, actually. This is a pub in the Norfolk Broads. And at a certain point, particularly just during the crisis, it found itself faced with closure. It had been providing a kind of service. There was a small community shop you can just see in the corner there attached to it. And when it was faced with extinction, the community got together and said, hang on a minute, this is providing us here with a service. It's building our community. It's giving us provisions. It's giving us a place to meet the community. We want to preserve this. They put their own money into it. They invested in it. And for as long as there are people coming to that obscure place in Norfolk, and as long as the investors are happy to keep their money in it, they have created a small social enterprise in a small corner of the UK that says to the capitalist model, we can do things slightly differently. We can build community enterprise from the bottom up. And that's not, of course, any kind of promise about the transformation of enterprise as a whole. It's one very small example. But the more that you look around, in fact, the more evidence there is that actually this sense of enterprise as doing something different is out there, is doing work for us already, a set of activities which are resource light, which provide the capabilities for people to flourish, which tread lightly on the earth in some way and deliver quality of life, are better integrated into community, and they provide decent, satisfying employment. And here's one of the interesting things about these activities. Because they are not inherently material activities or carbon-intensive activities, they tend to have a low environmental impact. They have a high employment intensity, so you can employ a lot of people in these activities, and a low material impact. So low carbon, high employment intensity. What could be wrong with this sector of the economy? The only thing that is wrong with it, actually, is that conventional economics tries to get rid of it as fast as it possibly can through the inevitable chasing of labour productivity growth, which is now, as we've seen, running out anyway in the advanced economies. So here, I suppose, is a vision that puts a different idea of work together with a different organisation of that work in terms of enterprise, and says, actually, there is nothing to lose here, because it employs people, because it makes the quality of our lives better, because it has low environmental impacts, and it is a place where we can reclaim, and I did say this was a choice, the advantages of having teachers and social workers and doctors and carers and people who renovate and people who build creatively and craftsmen who dedicate hours and hours to the development of something beautiful, and artists who try to improve and transform the quality of our lives through their creativity. Any kind of economy that's driving that stuff out of the market has to be an economy that doesn't work. And all of the activities that we can find and build on that do the opposite, that bring that sense of work back into shape, into its place in society, provide the foundations, one of the foundations for the economy of tomorrow. We can't do it all, of course, through this revisioning of work. If you look at my graph here, you'll see that one of the places which is very high carbon is the utilities sector, which is, amongst other things, is power and energy. And we do have to address that technological challenge, and a lot of that is about investment. But here we come back to another place in which we ask that question: what has our vision of investment been in a world that led to the financial crisis? What was going on in the minds of people as they bet and hedged on the price of different kinds of commodities into the future, and then took bets out against those hedges to make sure that when it collapsed they would benefit rather than lose? What was going on in the minds of people when actually the vast majority of our increase in investment over the last 50 years was not going into productive investment in the real economy at all? It was going into speculative investment in properties and in commodities and in financial markets. What was going on in the minds of the finance industry, which essentially was not financing the transition to sustainable development, but was busy financing itself? Finance is finance at the end of the day. What was going on was a kind of casino economy. And yet, my point is actually very simple, that if you go back to a sociological understanding of what investment is, it's about having a commitment towards the future. Economics has tried to cash that out in a particular way. The financial markets have taken it into all sorts of chaos. But the fundamental idea remains the same, that investment reflects our commitment to the future. It's the most fundamental relationship in economics in some way, because it is, and it's the one that most embodies the idea of sustainability, because it's talking about our relationship between now and tomorrow and the day after. And this idea that investment is commitment, that investment is commitment, it is a form of commitment, opens up the space for a whole different portfolio of investments. This is not the gambling casino that we saw in the run-up to the crisis. It's the places that gives us the renewable energy that I wanted way back in 1986 when I started working for Greenpeace. It's the place which talks about the huge dividend we get from having an energy-efficient housing stock or from low-carbon transport systems. It's the place which invests in ecological assets like forests and wetlands and habitats and agricultural soils, because they are the foundation even for basic material prosperity for us and for other species into the future. And it is also the place where you can think about investing in this idea of work and services, investing in a service-based economy where the quality of our time as a foundation for the future is funded, is invested, and has the correct infrastructure and architecture to make it happen. A whole portfolio of investment that is already to some extent out there, where people are already beginning to work in those areas. Some of them very small scale, some of them bigger scale, some of them in institutional investors, some in social and peer-to-peer investors, in a different kind of money economy. And money is my last foundation of those four that I was showing you in that diagram. And I came to it later in the journey of prosperity without growth, perhaps than I should have done. But when I did come across it, it seemed to me absolutely transformational, that you couldn't make any of this work unless you had some kind of transformation of the monetary system itself. Places where you could do different things with your money and make money work differently. Places where you could actually make real the idea that money is a social good, that it contributes to the way that we transact with one another, that it allows us to invest in the social infrastructure of society, that it provides the basis for governance, that money actually is a part of the glue of society and allows us to operate in effective ways that deliver the outcomes that we want. And it was very clear, particularly through the financial crisis, that the existing money system was just not doing that at all. And it has been the foundations for all of these kinds of initiatives that have gone on at the very small scale through people working inside mainstream institutional investors to work for change, the carbon disclosure projects that are going through at the moment, for example, the idea of investment for good, the idea that actually investment is a commitment and that people want to find those avenues for putting their own savings. And then a set of challenges at the macroeconomic level. This was one of the examples that I came across in looking about this, and this is at this issue, and it's just a very simple project in France, which through the power of the internet technology coming into its own there quite clearly, it connects people who want to save in a sustainable way with those who need investment funds. And it connects them at a project level so that we understand where our money is going rather than having it hidden behind a smokescreen of portfolios and funds and fund managers which tell us little or nothing about the sustainability of the underlying assets. So a way of bypassing the scheme itself. Here's another example which I didn't know actually, although I knew fair trade. This financial vehicle, shared interest, is the financial vehicle that allowed fair trade to work as a label, as a way of consumers saying, actually, I want the producers of the goods that I consume to be paid a decent living wage and to share properly in the proceeds of the supply chain. We lend money, but we're not a bank. Justice, not profit, is our bottom line. A different way of operating the financial system. And here, another that I like a lot, another example, is Triodos Bank, who for almost 25 years, a quarter of a decade, has created a model of investment totally in line with the demands of this kind of transition, of this sort of sustainability. And there's a lovely video, which you can see Triodos put together this video online, where they say growth is about more than just numbers, and they give so many examples of the places where the kinds of investments that you get when you think in these terms improve the quality of these lives. And the challenge still there along the bottom, sometimes what's bad for the economy is actually good for society. So you still have this underlying challenge that you've got to transform the economics of that money system itself. And this is where, actually, once again, you find with some surprise that the idea of transforming the money system has a very long pedigree. This is Henry Ford in the 1930s saying, it's a good job we don't understand this existing money system, because I think if people did, there'd be a revolution before tomorrow morning. And this is Milton Friedman in the 1940s arguing exactly for that case, a transformation of the money system in ways that would allow it to be more stable, better suited to investment, and create more fairness and justice in the economy. And the idea actually is a very simple one, that you either create a fractional reserve system or you create a sovereign money system. Both of these things have the effect of saying you do not any longer allow commercial interests to dominate the money supply itself. So you stop banks being able to create money by interest through interest-bearing debt as a way of controlling the money supply. And it's always been problematic. In the run-up to the crisis, it became catastrophic. In the aftermath of the crisis, this idea, in fact, that there's a needed reform in the money system has come to the fore in all sorts of places. There are political experiments, inquiries in Iceland, in Netherlands, in Switzerland for a sovereign money system that would allow, for example, governments to invest in the social infrastructure of their nation without having to pay interest to private commercial interests in order to do that, reversing the inequality that lay at the heart of the existing economy, the economy that didn't work. So what if we put those things together? Work as participation, investment as commitment, enterprise as service, money as a social good. Are we there yet? We're not entirely. There's masses of work to do in understanding where those social experiments, if you like, that I've pointed to are working and where they're not working, why they're working, why they're not working. There are three distinct challenges, I think. I'll just, in closing, want to say a little bit about those three. And the first of them is actually about economics. Again, it comes back to macroeconomics in this case, and it begins to ask us whether we have the tools that are fit for purpose. Because the macroeconomics that we've kind of inherited is a growth-based macroeconomics. It basically assumes that there are elements of the system that require growth in order to achieve stability and employment. And so there's a real question on people like me, a demand actually for people like me who are interested in a different kind of economics to come up with a few responses. Is it really the case that we need this kind of growth-based system in order to achieve stability and employment in the new economy? And together with an economist called Peter Victor, over the last few years, I've worked a lot on those kinds of questions. And I want to give you just one example of how fruitful it can be to ask those questions in that way. And it's around a fundamental aspect of macroeconomics, or of the arguments around interest and interest-bearing debt. And there's been an argument amongst ecological economists for a long time that if you have the charging of interest at all on any kind of debt or investment, then you have a growth imperative built into the system as a result of that. So if we want to get rid of growth, is the argument, you're going to have to get rid of banks and interest charging and everything in order to achieve that, which makes the idea of a low-growth economy or a no-growth economy even more difficult. And Peter and I were very interested in asking that question using some of the new economic models that have come out of the understandings of economics past the crisis, in particular a strand of models called stock flow consistent macroeconomic, ecological, post-Keynesian. It slips off the tongue very easily, the title of the particular macroeconomics, as you can tell. But it has enabled us, and enabled others actually, to look at these questions with some more depth and to ask, and to say, are there any fundamental reasons why we can't have a post-growth macroeconomics? Would we have to do away with interest altogether to get there? And actually our answer was no, interestingly. You can get a post-growth macroeconomics. This was our base case, it doesn't look very interesting because we were out there to prove that you could have it without instability arising. And then we said, well, what happens if you make it, shock it, make it unstable? What happens to your economy then? And yes, you get a little bit of instability, but actually, interestingly, it's not an inherent instability in the confines of our model. It brings you back into a kind of post-growth economy without making everything go wild. And then, quite legitimate, you say, yes, but you chose those parameters, didn't you? Could you have chosen them differently to make it go unstable? And yes, we could. Honesty requires a little bit of experimentation. And in this one, we allowed investors a little bit of what Keynes called animal spirits, that you overinvest when things are going well, you underinvest when things are going badly. And actually what happens when you put that into the model is you show exactly what Keynes might have suggested, that you get some instability back in the model. So what do we do at that point? Where do we go for solutions? And I'm using this in some way to illustrate what the process of inquiry should be through this exploration of a post-macro economics, indeed through a post-crisis economics. We actually appealed to ideas that had been in the literature again for 70 or 80 years and said, what if we allow our government to spend counter-cyclically into this instability, which means when you've got a growth rate that's higher than you want, you don't spend so much as a government. When you've got it lower than you want, you spend more into the economy. And this counter-cyclical spending, exactly as Keynes predicted, exactly as Hyman Minsky predicted, brought us back to the idea that we could stabilize this post-growth economy even in the presence of positive interest rates. That was a little illustration, if you like, of how you can systematically identify and pursue these research questions, and that sometimes unexpected things come out of them. We had asked a question about interest rates, and we ended up answering a question about the role of government in such an economy. And we found, in fact, that there is an absolutely critical role for government in providing, if you like, employer of last resort, stabilizer of last resort, a place where you can spend into the economy to create stability and maintain stability. But the broader implications of that are my second challenge, which is the idea of the state. Sorry, I have the wrong picture here. The progressive state as a guardian of prosperity. On a day like today, when we don't know what we're going to be looking at politically in 6 weeks' time, I feel I should be a little more careful about my geographical location. This idea, actually, and it's a very pertinent one for our time, is that we've thrown away the role of the state. We've taken it out of our arguments, and we've sort of made the case that it's the market that knows best. Actually, to bring back a progressive idea of the state, that it has a fundamental role to play, even in something as simple as stabilizing the economy, because of the nature of government spending as opposed to the nature of market spending. And that actually beyond that, you can think of the progressive state as a place that can pursue the institutions and the change and the transition and provide the foundations for flourishing at the level of social enterprise and create the conditions on which you can have investment as a commitment and even, of course, take something of sovereign control for the money system. And this idea of a progressive state and a progressive politics is the second of the challenges that I think comes out. And then beyond that, there's clearly a sort of challenge for us. What does it all mean? Are we looking at a dysfunctional world in which our current trajectory in pursuit of fun, if you like, a good life, prosperity, well-being, takes us a little bit in that direction to start with, but because it uses so much stuff, so much carbon, so much environmental impact, it takes us to a very dystopian place where the world actually is denuded of resources and degraded in its environment, and there's not much fun left either. If we just turn that off, if we go for a kind of hair-shirt model of the future, we're likely to get very little traction in the world. A place with no fun, a place without enjoyment, a place, yes, where we manage to meet our environmental targets through some form of, I don't know, eco-fascism or through some collapse of the economy of the whole, absolutely not the sort of thing that you can win any elections on whatsoever. And so if you like, our more fun, less stuff quadrant in the bottom corner of this little thought experiment is where we have to be, what we have to understand. And of course, high technology and improvements in efficiency and all of that stuff that I started my career out with looking at and believing in are still important in that more fun, less stuff way. But also perhaps there's another route which is more around a kind of slow living. It is around the durability of products. It is around the time spent by teachers in classrooms and doctors with patients and craftsmen on building products. It's around the longevity of those products. It's around the lifestyles that we lead that are slower and less harried than they were before. It's around thinking of a different ideal of life. Here, and this is articulated as well as I could do it, really, by somebody who has more authority than I will ever have. I'm not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on, that the trampling, crashing, elbowing and treading on each other's heels are the most desirable lot of humankind. The best state for human nature is that which, while no one is poor, no one desires to be richer, nor has any reasons to fear being thrust back by the efforts of others to push themselves forward. It's a claim, and it's by John Stuart Mill, the father, if you like, of classical economics, that actually we are not just the selfish, novelty-seeking consumers that neoclassical economics, that our existing institutions, that consumer society, that advertisers, and the dysfunctional monetary system and financial system demands that we be in order to have an economy that works, that actually we are as much other regarding as we are selfish. And that we do not just chase novelty continually at the margin, we care to some extent about tradition. And that seems like a kind of good place to stop and get you to challenge and ask some questions, because it sort of brings me back to where I started with, the history, the tradition, the personal history, the story of St Andrews and of sustainability. And to remember, as we do say, that we think about where we came from and what led us to the place we are now, that is a fundamental place for understanding what our futures hold and what they don't hold. And what they don't hold, for any of us really, is a world which goes on being the same somehow as we think of it now, or the same as we thought of it 35 years ago. A world in which, actually, as Prospero in The Tempest reminded me when I was in The Tempest playing Prospero those 35 years ago, that we are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. A sense of the transitory nature of our existence as individuals and even of our societies. And if there is a good that comes out of that, a long-term vision for prosperity, it's one in which what we leave for others and what we give to others along the way becomes the primary arbiter of tradition, of prosperity, of quality of life. And that's why, of course, this is a fantastic lecture to be able to give here in St Andrews, where that principle has been enshrined in the geography of the town from the moment the town was formed. And it's been a great pleasure to share the 10th anniversary of your course with you today. Thank you very much.
Tim, how wonderful. I'm sure there are questions. So let's have some questions from the audience. Nathan.
So, in the population predictions for 2050 or 2100, I don't know, population is expected to reach 9 billion at some point around mid-century. In this model where we have a steady state economy that's not really growing, what would it look like for both what we currently call developing countries, like how much would they have to grow in this model, and how much would developed countries have to contract in order to reach a sustainable level of income and throughput?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's it's one of those questions where you can at least do a little bit of work in terms of understanding how the arithmetic works, which isn't done a lot actually. But is done, for example, as you say, in things like the population projections, which is 10 billion by the middle of this century, in the latest UN projections, and in the speed in which, for example, you can decarbonize your economies. You can ask questions about that. In what you assume about affluence, your question about, what does it mean for incomes in these places? And there's no definitive answer there, but there's a very clear way of articulating that challenge, in that it's what I suppose I approach that through is a kind of contraction and convergence of incomes to a level that looks as though you can reasonably meet your technological targets. And you can argue about what reasonable means or what the speed of contraction and convergence is, but basically it is a place that allows developing countries to grow. It is a place that even can allow the poorest countries in the world to catch up to a median level of income. It's even a place in which you can see some growth still in middle-income countries like China, Brazil, India. The real challenge is in the developed country level of income. If you want the whole world to catch up to developed world levels of income, so that your contraction converges to a target of, let's say 50, 60,000, $80,000 per capita, and that's still growing at 2% per annum. That's the place where things become almost utopian, heroic in their assumptions about technological change. But in a middle income range, where you could still allow some growth in middle income countries, and you could certainly allow catch up in the least developed countries, the challenge there is very explicitly a challenge of a kind of managed degrowth in the advanced economies, a place where our economies are maintain their stabilities, but we're not looking at the same kind of growth rates. So your question, absolutely pertinent question, is what's the dynamics of those various changes in those different places? The one that really rules itself out quite quickly is a world in which you expect everyone to catch up to developed levels of income, and that's still growing at 2% per year. The ones that become more feasible are ones where you have this kind of contract and converge characteristic.
How likely do you think it is for the world to manage to stay within 2 degrees increase from pre-industrial levels of temperature?
How feasible is it? How likely is it? I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea. The world that we're living in is full of contradictions. And in November 2015, when Paris agreed not just to 2 degrees but to 1.5 degrees, you would say there was a political consensus that had never been there before, an extraordinary political consensus. But even some of the people who forged that consensus were in the process of undermining it, actually, for political reasons at the same time. So, countries that were very much, which were the architects of the 1.5 degree target, actually mining their own mineral resources as fast as they can, saying, which sensible country in the world would leave 173 billion tons of oil in the ground when it could be contributing to the exchequer. And that's very much the world that we live in, which is a conflicted, unclear world in which being able to say that it's likely or unlikely, it's really difficult to do and may not necessarily help us. Maybe what helps us, that's to say, is if we want to make that practical, if we want to make that feasible, what's the next practical step towards it.
Yes, please.
A lot of talk about like a no-growth economy, or just generally achieving sustainability makes assumptions about us being more parsimonious, adopting more like hunky-dory values. But people like Naomi Klein have suggested that something like a Green New Deal, as she put it, might be the best path forward. And it sounds like you kind of agree in certain regards. What would that look like? And more importantly, how could you conceive of politicians trying to mainstream that idea and really like sell it to the public as something that benefits them as it would, making the economy both sustainable and more equal, rather than as something to be swallowed like bitter medicine?
Yeah, the Green New Deal's means different things to different people. So, I mean, actually, it emerged first in around about the time of the crisis as a way, and on the back of the idea of the New Deal itself back in the 1930s, which was when Roosevelt came to power and basically said, this system's screwed, we're going to have to fix it. And then the first 100 days laid down a whole raft of policies, a lot of which actually had an impact which has lasted to today, because they were about public investment programs in schools and in transport systems and in health infrastructures. And so and at about the time of the crisis, actually Gordon Brown came, of course, not a million miles away from here, put forward to the Davos meeting in January 2009, put forward a proposal for a Green New Deal, which was very much saying what the world needs now is stimulus. Let's invest in the right thing. So let's, to go back to my slide, let's invest in that portfolio of things that I put up, particularly the ones at the top, which he saw as being the way towards a low-carbon economy, a stimulus of the economy itself, and a stabilization of the financial crisis. And that idea of a Green New Deal has been taken forward in lots of different ways. One thing that's problematic about it, the way that it was seen originally in the original Keynesian intention, is that basically, the object of the Green New Deal is to get you back to the growth-based economy that you started with. And then, of course, you have to run faster and faster to stay in the same place if you want to keep the economy going and you want to keep meeting those goals. Then it becomes a very dramatic and heroic kind of place to be. And the ideas of people like Naomi Klein and indeed Yanis Varoufakis and the DiEM25 movement, and to some extent I would argue what I'm talking about here, is that instead of sort of chasing something which is stimulus-based, that you put in place in order to get back the growth-based economy that you believe will solve all your problems that you had in the first place, is to go back to these first principles and say what does this investment strategy actually invest in? What does enterprise actually do here? What vision of work is going to inform our sense of that economy? And in those sense, I think that sense of a Green New Deal is a very good place to start asking questions about the economy of tomorrow, about the foundations for that economy.
Okay, perhaps one more question.
Don't you think a likely scenario could be that the economy sort of naturally self-controls itself as soon as the environmental costs get kind of internalized, and being environmental is just going to be economically feasible and comfortable?
It's clearly true to say that if the environmentally good things to do are also cheaper and easier, then yes, people will tend to do them, and so that'll make the transition easier, and so eventually you can get to that place where you've got the best of both worlds. Where all the disagreement lies, it seems to me, is what's the way to do that? And I suppose what I'm challenging is a view that says the way to do that is to let the market do its thing, because it does it very effectively, to get government to stand out of the way, to let technology progress as fast as possible, and then everything will be okay. And actually, I think if you look at each of those assumptions, they're each problematic. So that although I absolutely don't disagree with you that the best outcome, if you like, is a place where those environmentally good things are also the cheapest and also the easiest and also give us more fun with less stuff. Actually, we have to think more seriously about how to get there than simply accepting the conventional wisdom, which says that as long as we allow the growth-based vision of prosperity to progress, then we'll inevitably come back to that place in the long run. And I think that's an assumption that we should challenge very seriously, and putting in a place to deliver exactly what you're suggesting, a place where the right thing is actually the easiest thing and the cheapest thing and the most fun thing. That's our challenge as a society, and an economic challenge as well. What kind of economy will take us there?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to call on Dr. Rahima White, lecturer in sustainable development, to give a vote of thanks for this talk.
Thanks.
I'm aware I stand between you and dinner, so I will be brief, I promise you. I think there's a couple of things to say about this. This book was first published 7 or 8 years ago in the first edition, and some of the ideas are still not accepted. Some of the ideas are still being tackled. They are simple, yet they are also complex, and that is typical of many of the sustainability debates we have to follow. And I think it's also a lesson for many of us to actually have the persistence to follow up some of our ideas and to keep some of those ideas going in different ways. Some people said the timing of the first edition was excellent, and some people said it was very problematic. It didn't fall on fertile ground in very many ways. But the timing was right in the middle of when we were getting the Sustainable Development Programme up and going, and that's what this talk is about celebrating 10 years of the honours teaching in this sort of era. And in those past 10 years, I think we've nurtured many graduates in sustainable development. We've tried to persuade as many as we can to read this book and to read many other books. And then we've sent a lot of the graduates out into the world already. We think that universities are partly about not just learning about stuff, they're partly about learning how to think. And I think that's one thing today's lecture has taught us, is that there are sometimes different ways of looking at some of the challenges we have that might help us in thinking about the future. We like to think of this university as a place where that's possible, where we can dare to be different, where we can dare to innovate, where we can dare to be creative and to challenge some of the boundaries that we see across academic disciplines, across theory and practice, where a physicist can become an economist, where a scientist can become an artist, somewhere where we can actually think about things in a very different kind of way before we send out our graduates into the world, so that they can reconfigure the challenges we have to face as well as actually tackle them head on. This is a really rare moment for us, I think, to actually pause in the hectic work that we have to do here at the university and to celebrate some of what we have done so far. And to be thankful that although we've had some ups and some downs and some blips and some difficult moments, and as is the case in everything, that we've actually managed to achieve a lot in the last 10 years. So many thanks to all of those who have made that possible, to all of the academic staff, but also to the operational staff, the support staff, those staff who work with the community, people within the immediate and wider community as well, who have supported this initiative in different kinds of ways. And many thanks to Tim for coming and giving us such an inspiring talk that has really allowed us to take such a wide scope, such a wide vision of some of the fundamental aspects we have to face ahead of us just now. Now, you're not going to be allowed to just escape. Those of you who've been inspired by this talk have the opportunity to buy the second edition here. So we have discounted versions which are going to be signed, and I promise you that will be a good investment. It will appreciate. I would really appreciate it if the students all bought it and read it before the end of the semester. So please take that opportunity before you go. But one last time, just join me in thanking Tim for coming and talking to us today.